Want to say good evening, everybody. I'm Monica Reedus, president of the Democratic Women's Club. I want to thank you all, members, for joining us tonight for This Week in Tallahassee. We have an exceptional guest tonight with us, and his name is John Harris Maurer, who is the Public Policy Director for Equality Florida. For reference, Equality Florida advocates for civil rights and protections for the LGBTQ residents of Florida. Translation, advocacy for most every single aspect of the DeSantis hashtag state Republican legislative hateful agenda right now. I'm sure he's going to have a lot to deliver to us this evening. We want to thank you, John Harris, for sharing your evening with us and taking time to discuss our current legislative affairs here in Tallahassee. Chair Edwards, I will turn it over to you for the introduction.
Yes, good evening. Thank you, Madam President. John Harris Maurer with Equality Florida's Public Policy Director is the frontline lobbyist for the LGBTQ equality in the Capitol, and he leads local policy work around the state. He attended Rice University. He received his law degree from Florida State University, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Law Review. Before he came to Florida, his prior stint was at the Texas House of Representatives, the Florida House of Representatives, and working at the Anise Parker for Mayor campaign in Houston, which successfully elected the first openly lesbian mayor of a major American city. He has spent 5 years in private legal practice for administrative and environmental law. And he volunteers, outside of work, he volunteers with the Children's Home Society and Leadership Florida. And we are happy to have him. John Harris, you have the floor. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much to the Democratic Women's Club of Florida for hosting me. I hope my audio is coming through all right, and I apologize if I sound a little gravelly. My husband and I have a 4.5-month-old new little baby girl, which we love dearly, and she has brought home all the expected crud from daycare. So we're all getting through that. That is much less concerning than the crud that is coming out of the Capitol, if you all have seen any of that yet. So just to orient ourselves where we are procedurally, we have now made it through committee weeks, which are sort of those weeks leading up to the official start of legislative session when all the lawmakers are still coming up to Tallahassee. They're filing bills are starting to move through committee, but they're not doing some of the final steps of work for legislative session. So that will officially begin next Tuesday, March 7th. We'll also have a much better sense of what the full legislative slate will look like at that time, because March 7th, the first official day of session, is also the last day for lawmakers to file their individual bills. As with everything in the legislative process, there are some caveats to that. You can still see bills introduced later if they're introduced by the whole committee rather than a single lawmaker. But really, in about a week, we should have the full set of bills in front of us. And that's particularly important this year because things have been moving in some ways very slowly. I think Governor DeSantis has sort of put out his new MO on governance, and that is a lot of special sessions. So we've seen a lot of the time in committee weeks be eaten up with those special sessions rather than the usual build-up to session we would see. But I'll say there are 4 bills that Equality Florida is really expecting to be at the top of our legislative slate, and a week out from session, still none of them have been filed. And we have, I would say, virtual certainty that all of them are coming. So we're just sort of waiting for them. There can be a strategy in that too. Sometimes leadership will leave those bills to the very end so that we have sort of, those of us in the advocacy space have the least amount of time to respond to them and prepare for them before they're up in hearings during the legislative session. But 4 that we're really expecting, and where I think a lot of Equality Florida's work will focus, is first an extension of last session's Don't Say LGBTQ or Don't Say Gay bill. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but just to give you a preview, the Don't Say LGBTQ expansion. The second, a ban on gender affirming care, so healthcare for transgender folks. Third, some bill around drag performances. We don't have a lot of intel on what that will look like, but bills have been filed in 14 other states. We've heard some talks from leadership about it. There's sort of no way that we won't see something about it, so we know that's coming. And then the fourth, that there's definitely no question, is further attacks on reproductive freedom and sort of an enhanced abortion ban. I think that one is sort of just being negotiated between the House and the Senate right now. So it's not that it's not coming, they're just figuring out just how restrictive it will be. So we do have some priorities that are proactive as well. I'll touch on those a little bit later if we get some time there, but we all sort of know what the legislative makeup is, particularly now with Republican supermajorities in both chambers. Equality Florida has long been called first and foremost to do defensive work. And as mentioned, we are the state's largest civil rights organization that's dedicated to securing full equality for Florida's LGBTQ community. But we do that with I would say, a pretty broad lens, understanding that a lot of our issues are intersectional. And really, what we are seeing right now out of the DeSantis administration is this sort of overarching censorship agenda that is really focused on authoritarian control and trying to sort of decide, whose story can be told, who can be acknowledged, who is valuable. So, it may be that in some corners, a book ban for some folks is really centered on any materials with LGBTQ characters or, a pair of same-sex parents, but they don't stop there either. Those banned books lists are also full of authors of color and stories of, like I Am Rosa Parks is on a banned books list. So we know that they're not just trying to target one community, they're trying to, in many ways, divide up the communities and sort of almost pick us off one by one. But we're finding power in sort of standing together and helping to shape that collective narrative because we know what the numbers are like and how difficult it is in that process. And I would say even just the atmosphere in the building feels very different. I'm coming into my 5th legislative session in this role for Equality Florida. And I think the posture even from our lawmakers among the Democrats is different now. It has been uphill for them the whole time I've been there. But I think they're really looking to folks like me, folks like y'all, to help build them up and give them the courage. It is hard up there to be a lawmaker right now as a Democrat. For different reasons, it's hard as a Republican too, because they don't get to sort of have any independent thought or do what they want. They're all just towing the line for Governor DeSantis. But for Democrats in particular, they're really going into battle day after day, knowing that they are really fighting an uphill fight. So to the extent you're, seeing those folks at town halls or crossing paths with them, I think giving them that encouragement, reminding them that they are still there fighting for really important principles, fighting for people like you, like me, that matter, is really helpful in this environment. So it's a little side soapbox, but I know that it does make a difference to them. So they know that there are people in rooms like this one, and it really is impactful when they get to hear from you. So, to that point, Equality Florida, like y'all may be thinking about, is really trying to define what success and what victories look like in this space. That's probably not going to look like passing every proactive bill we would like this session, but we still got to show up. We've got to do the public education. We've got to make sure folks know what's happening in the building. And I'm not sure if this is a C4 space, but ultimately hold them accountable when elections come around. So they do have to know that we're watching. With respect to some of those legislative priorities, I mentioned first and foremost the Don't Say LGBTQ bill. As a reminder, folks are probably familiar with that from last session, but as introduced last session, it was a complete ban on classroom instruction about sexual orientation or gender identity in kindergarten through 3rd grade. And that's significant because when you talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, that's about who we are and who we love. And it's even not just the LGBTQ community, because everybody has a sexual orientation. You could be gay, straight, bisexual, what have you. Everybody has a gender identity, whether you're transgender, cisgender, what have you. In practice, we know that this is really about targeting the LGBTQ community. And even really supportive districts like Orange County Public Schools, we've had a terrific relationship with for years. I would say they're one of the districts in the state that was sort of doing the best by their LGBTQ youth. And when that bill became law, they put out guidance saying that, teachers had to peel the safe space stickers off their classrooms. They said that same-sex teachers couldn't have a picture of their spouse on their desk. That is wild to me. I don't even know how you get to pictures on a desk from classroom instruction, but it is the point of the legislation. And it's something that we've seen in a lot of these bills. It's drafted vaguely, and there's a lot of liability that comes along with it. So in an abundance of caution, folks will sort of overly censor themselves. And that's the point, is to have that chilling effect. Whether it's about LGBTQ issues, whether it is DEI more broadly, or the quote unquote Stop Woke Act from last session, and talking about whether we can have honest and sometimes difficult conversations about American history. There are parts of our history that do and should make people uncomfortable, but that's not a reason we shouldn't talk about them. But legislation like the Stop Woke Act, like Don't Say LGBTQ, just has this chilling effect that is designed to make people fearful so that they won't engage in this space and this discussion at all. So this session, we expect to see an expansion of that. I mentioned last session it was kindergarten through third grade, and then there's sort of an effective ban up through 12th grade because it was for grades 4 through 12, unless deemed or as deemed age appropriate only. And we know that there are some folks in this administration that think it is never appropriate to talk about LGBTQ folks. And really what we're asking for is just to make sure that LGBTQ youth, LGBTQ families like my own can be acknowledged in a classroom just like anybody else. My daughter should be able to recognize or see images that have families that look like her in a classroom. That's what you're talking about when you talk about sexual orientation and gender identity. What we're not talking about, though those advancing the bill would want you to believe it, I think, is talking about like sexual activity. Nobody is saying that we should be talking about that sort of sexual activity with a first grader. But we know that's not what the legislation was focused on, because when some of our Democratic champions introduced amendments to narrow it to that, to say specifically we should not be talking about sexual activity, or there shouldn't be any efforts to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, those amendments were rejected by the majority, suggesting they were trying to get to something broader. So now they're likely to come back and expand that complete ban up through 8th grade. Every kid in 8th grade has a cell phone. Every kid in 8th grade has access to the internet. I don't know what they think they're stopping discussion about, but it is about that censorship and the government getting to choose sort of what information is out there and what stories can be told. My hunch is that it will go beyond just the grade range expansion. Another issue that we've seen a lot that y'all have probably touched on is around book banning. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more of a crackdown on those instructional materials. And we have seen that in some other legislation already. That would basically first remove control from independent school districts and say the State Department of Education gets to have all the say over curriculum. And also that as soon as a book is challenged, it is automatically removed from circulation, pending that review. That is particularly wild to me, again, in this censorship vein, when you consider that it doesn't have to be a parent whose child, has access to that book who is challenging the book. Anyone in the county can object. You don't even have to have a kid in the public school system. So whatever your agenda is, basically all you have to do is would be, if this bill passes, file your objection and get that book pulled out of circulation sort of indefinitely until somebody, reviews it and the school board makes a decision. So a lot of concerns in that education space. And y'all have probably seen that there's been a lot of talk about sort of defunding any DEI programs. I mean, it is, again, by no means limited to the LGBTQ space. But I think about how many colleges and universities have, offices of multicultural affairs that do, obviously, programming around different religious observances. You have, DEI offices that handle veterans issues or women's issues on campus. So really wide-ranging impact. And my hope is that, and I think in some cases we're seeing this is true, people are starting to understand how broad these attacks are and how they are all linked together. So when Governor DeSantis, tries to ban African-American AP history, it's not just about African-American history. It is this broader censorship framework. So I apologize for how many times I'm going to say censorship tonight if you haven't picked up on the theme.
Do not apologize. Trust me.
Yeah, I'm also sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But we also, again, see a lot of those attacks on gender-affirming care. So that is healthcare for transgender individuals. It has been a topic on our radar a lot over the summer, through the fall, the winter, because you may have seen some headlines already about it. And what has been going on is an administrative process. So distinguishing the administrative process that the agencies go through from the legislative process in the Capitol. On the administrative side, the Board of Medicine and Board of Osteopathy, basically under the Department of Health, have been pursuing their own rulemaking about effectively terminating gender-affirming care by going after the licensure for the doctors that they oversee. Now what we're looking at is the legislature likely coming in, and my expectation is that they'll do something like imposing criminal penalties. So the agency can't levy those kind of criminal penalties. The legislature could. The legislature has said that they want to do that. We've seen it happen in other states. In some cases, they're criminalizing the doctors. In some cases, they're criminalizing the parents. There's, again, a wild overreach that Tallahassee politicians think that they should be inserting themselves between parents, young people, and doctors who are, following guidance from the majority of the mainstream medical and mental health associations in supporting gender-affirming care. But that's where we are. There was a panel discussion last week in the legislature about this, entirely one-sided, with members just picked by the committee chair, Representative Randy Fine. I found it personally incredibly offensive. The whole thing was sort of a charade. But at the end, he compared gender-affirming care to medical experiments conducted on Holocaust victims. And just like the level of rhetoric, and it's disgusting out there. For those of you who are following along closely, I appreciate all you're doing to educate yourself. There's a lot of toxicity coming out of the legislature. I know, particularly for some of our transgender brothers and sisters, following along is really, really hard. So I also understand it's got to tune out at some point for your own mental health. But we're all sort of taking our turns here as it is. That gender-affirming care space is another one that we expect to see legislation on. And, I think, look, they're taking advantage of an issue that a lot of people just aren't familiar with. I myself, as much as I'm honored to get to do LGBTQ advocacy for a living every day, am not an expert on transgender healthcare. And most of us don't know what it's like to be a transgender person or to be a parent just trying to find healthcare for your transgender kid. And they play on fear and the sort of misinformation there to really score what are, sort of cheap political points for a DeSantis Republican 2024 political primary for the presidential run. So it's an area that we've seen them really focus on a lot. I also mentioned drag. That seems to be sort of a more emerging area. Excuse me. Where they found, political utility in vilifying this. Drag is a performance art. It is about freedom of expression. It has been going on for centuries, and it is common in popular culture, frankly. I mean, whether it is Mrs. Doubtfire or the Medea movies, most productions of Peter Pan actually cast a woman as Peter Pan. There's nothing inherently offensive or untoward about drag. There are pageants, there's pageantry that's just about, high glamour. There are drag queen story hours that are specifically curated for a young audience. But again, I think they're playing a lot of fear and misunderstanding there. It's a place where we're not quite sure what that bill will look like as much as we know some of the others. In some states, we've seen them trying to basically like rezone or redesignate venues that host drag to be quote unquote sexually oriented businesses akin to a strip club or an adult store, which then also means, you can only be in certain land use areas or you can't be within 1,000 feet of a church or a school or what have you. So that's one approach we've seen. Another approach is just defining drag, or I guess being in drag, as lewd and lascivious conduct. And that presents a lot of concerns for transgender folks who are now worried, if I get on stage at an open mic night or to do karaoke or a stand-up comedy show, am I potentially, criminally liable for that? So remains to be seen, but we know there will be something coming there. And again, it's a space where we have this administration on one hand trying to say that they are all about parents' rights, and yet they want to intervene between that parent trying to find health care for their transgender child. They want to intervene for that parent who may say, I think my child is mature enough to see whatever performance this is. In the same way that we say, parents can take a kid to a rated R movie if they think that kid is mature enough for it. That's one of those questions or judgment calls that is within the purview of a parent until the DeSantis administration decides to step in and parent instead. So a lot of frustration there. And then finally, I'm sure you all have seen what has been going on in the abortion space in prior legislative sessions. We know that they will be coming back and clamping down on that more. And I will say that share a brief personal story. I mentioned we have a 4.5-month-old, went through surrogacy, and last summer we were in the process with our surrogate, and I was in the OBGYN's office, and they were doing a ultrasound, and there had been some genetic testing that came back with inconclusive results. And the OBGYN was basically explaining how there hadn't been enough genetic material to do this testing. And they said, we're going to try the test again. And the third time, we really don't recommend doing it again. It just means the test doesn't work for you. There's sort of, one other more extreme alternative, but we really don't recommend it. Or some people know that, no matter the results of that chromosomal testing, they're going to go through with the pregnancy anyways, and they wouldn't disrupt it. And we're sort of sitting there in the dark, like examining room with the surrogate, on the examining table, wand on her stomach, looking at the sonograms in real time. And the OBGYN said, if you would consider interrupting a pregnancy, you do have to consider that you're now beyond 15 weeks and we're in Florida, and as of July 1st, that is not an option that you have in the state. And at the time, we're waiting for the Supreme Court to rule on the Dobbs case, re-examining Roe v. Wade, and we don't know what the landscape will look like by that. And it was one of the most infuriating moments, well, probably the most infuriating moment of the process. Much of it was very joyful. But to be sitting in that room and feeling like there were lawmakers in that room with me who I, have to see professionally on a routine basis, who would have any say in like what our family chose about how to go forward at that point, was so deeply offensive. And it's one of the places that we draw these lines for Equality Florida's work and say, our work for LGBTQ equality is not just about LGBTQ non-discrimination, but we realize that things like reproductive freedom are causes in common, because at base, they share this foundational connection about freedom from governmental intrusion into our most intimate decision-making about who we form a family with or whether we're going to form a family and how and when. And those are really personal decisions that, again, lawmakers in Tallahassee just shouldn't be a part of. And yet, all expectations are that the lawmakers will introduce another abortion ban. It could be something as low as 6 weeks. Really, I would say at the point of 6 weeks, most people consider that completely a functional abortion ban because there are so many that don't even realize they're pregnant at that stage. So we get to work really closely with Planned Parenthood. They're probably the other advocates that we work most closely with in the Capitol. And it is, again, a really tough fight because we know, what the votes are, but I think that accountability is really important there and making sure that people know what's going on in Tallahassee and also what resources are. One of the things we do, this is again a little bit of an aside, is a lot of public education so that folks do know what their options are. Like right now, we're trying to make sure that people understand gender affirming care is not currently illegal. If you want to seek that care, you still can, you still should. There's nothing that stops the doctor legally from offering that care. How much longer that is true for, that remains to be seen, but same thing with abortion. We're careful in our language so that we're not suggesting right now that abortion is illegal in Florida, because there are still folks who can have that access within the state, and it's important to make sure that they know that they still can. And if and when that changes, we'll update our messaging, and there's a lot of work we can do with things like abortion funds to try to help folks get access where they need it. But that messaging is really important, and so we are happy to follow the lead of folks like Planned Parenthood who have a lot of expertise in that area to make sure that we're sort of in alignment in how we're talking about these issues. So I'll pause there since I've been rambling for about 30 minutes already and see if there's any questions. I see a little bit of commentary going on in the chat. That's a little hard for me to follow, but any questions or reflections on what I mentioned already? If we can do that, I don't know, Francine, if I'm allowed to open up the floor that way, or if you have a different format.
No, that's fine. There were just a couple of things you were talking about, men dressing up as women, Milton Berle, Medea. I mean, it's just so arbitrary how they would take a performance and turn it into something that is sexual and just out of the pale. One of the questions that I have about the bill that just dropped about the gender affirming care, the data that the governor is insisting to receive from the colleges, from colleges. What happened to HIPAA laws? I mean, how does he get around? What's the end run around that? Can you tell? I mean, does that? That's just a question.
So for those who aren't familiar, Chris Spencer, which is basically Governor DeSantis' policy budget director, put out a request to all Florida colleges and universities asking about any gender affirming care that they're giving. And for most people, I'll back up a step and talk about gender affirming care generally. Usually at the outset, that looks like what we just call social transition. So for a very young person, or really for anybody, social transition is like haircuts, the clothing you're wearing, maybe changing your name, nothing medical, nothing physical. That's just social transition. A next phase would be something for young people like puberty blockers. And that is about delaying some of those developments so that people have more time to think about their journey to process gender identity. You may have folks who continue on to cross-sex hormones. So somebody who's assigned male at birth may then be taking estrogen. Somebody who's assigned female at birth may be taking testosterone. And some folks will choose to have surgery. And it's worth noting here, there's sort of no definition of like what makes somebody properly transgender or fully transgender. There are transgender folks who want all of the surgery. There are transgender folks who want none of the surgery. So there's sort of no like right way to be trans, but that is some of the care that we're talking about when we talk about gender affirming care. Could be puberty blockers, could be hormones, could be surgery. Most of the discussion in Florida has focused on that care for minors. It is exceedingly rare to see surgical or interventions or surgery with minors. You can't say it never happens, but I mean, really, I think it's like about 6 to 8 or 10 instances a year. And so to Francine's question, some of that happens through independent providers. There are also some universities that have, obviously, medical schools, health centers. University of Florida has a youth gender program and clinic. So the state requested a slew of information from all these institutions about how many people were requesting care, what type of care they were requesting, what care was given, mental health services given. There was a question of how did they do that with HIPAA. In theory, all that data is anonymized, so it's not tied to a specific individual and their name, and it's not, you couldn't identify them. But again, as we were talking about before, with sort of this censorship approach, the whole idea is just this chilling effect, so that those universities, those institutions now know they're under the microscope for offering these sort of services. They are likely to be defunded to the extent they say they offer these services. So you sort of don't need to know if it is John Harris showing up for that care, just that it has happened. And now, that university is going to face some repercussions for it. We saw this sort of punitive approach last session, if you recall. There was the so-called dirty dozen school districts. And those were the districts that wanted to have, I believe it was mask mandates, even when DeSantis didn't want them anymore. And then you had Representative Randy Fine, who's actually the same one who's running the gender affirming care ban, come in and try to penalize all of those 12 districts in the budgetary process. So it may be that, on the letter of the law, on plain paper, it says we're just looking for this information, but we all know there are political consequences tied to it.
If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Pamela Schwartz says, when students question the family descriptions of other students in a class or comment on another's mannerisms or use blatant bullying behaviors in schools, how does the bill address dealing with these, even if educators are not specifically including LGBTQ plus instruction, curriculum, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Pamela. Thank you. If I can restate it a little bit, because this is an issue that came up a lot last session. The bill, Don't Say LGBTQ, as we were talking about, banned classroom instruction on sexual orientation, gender identity, basically saying, thou shalt not put that in your lesson plan. And so Democratic lawmakers said, well, again, like my daughter, you have kids who have same-sex parents. When you say, what did you do over spring break? Somebody's going to say, I went to, the water park with my dad. How is a teacher allowed to respond? In the legislative process, the lawmakers said, well, the bill doesn't prohibit that. A teacher would, in theory, be able to respond to a question from a student. But in practice, again, it's an area where you would have that chilling effect. What teacher wants to take that risk, to lose their licensure, lose their job and their livelihood for their family because somebody says, well, you asked a question about families and that sort of invited the discussion. So Equality Florida's position, we want to be aggressive in arguing now for the narrowest reading of that bill, of course, so that it does the least harm. And in that space, our position is, responding to a question shouldn't be considered that sort of classroom instruction. But the impact of these bills, again, is that broader chilling that will just stifle those conversations altogether, whether or not a judge would say, that is or isn't within the bounds of the law.
Joy Burgess asks, what about Medicaid expansion legislation? Since the federal government pays for 90% of its care when a state expands Medicaid, how has it been so hard to pass this type of legislation in Florida? I guess she's talking about Medicaid expansion. Does that have
Well,
to
so
do
where
with
that has come to
affirming?
our, yeah, where that has come into our lane recently, excuse me, is around gender affirming care. And states generally were falling into three buckets. Either they explicitly said that there was Medicaid coverage for gender affirming care, they explicitly said there wasn't coverage for Medicaid for gender affirming care, or they were silent. And what Florida did basically over the summer and the fall was they were one of the states that moved from being silent to saying there is no coverage. We've seen multiple states do that, and multiple of those states have actually lost in the courts on that basis. Unfortunately, that didn't stop Florida. We've seen numerous cases where the Florida legislature and now Florida agencies will proceed with rulemakings sort of because they are picking that fight. There's actually another censorship bill I'll touch on in a minute that's very much in that lane of sort of looking for that fight. But we saw it in the abortion space too, right? Like even before the Dobbs decision, you had states like Alabama, Texas passing these laws because they wanted to get to the Supreme Court. They wanted to have an opportunity to re-examine that precedent and overturn it. So how things should operate under Medicaid versus how they do are unfortunately two different questions there.
Pat Weber says, aren't government bills about suppressing speech First Amendment violations? Yes. Can't we pursue that in the courts? But by that time, the damage is already done though, huh?
Yeah. Yes on all accounts, and yes, that we still need to pursue them in the courts, even though the legislature continues to pass these unconstitutional bills at great expense to Floridians, might I say. One of the arguments in things like Medicaid coverage is like, well, public money shouldn't be going to offering this care, and yet they will spend far more defending the unconstitutional lawsuit about depriving folks of that care than they ever would have for actually just offering the care. But your First Amendment point is really well taken, and it actually touches on the bill that I alluded to a few minutes ago. There is another bill that has been introduced in the House and Senate now. We're referring to it as the defamation censorship bill. And I'll try not to get too wonky, but as a reminder, basically defamation is the claim that you would often see from a public official against, say, a media outlet when they feel like they have been defamed, that is to say, sort of lied about and cast in an improper and false light. We have a very famous Supreme Court precedent, the Sullivan v. New York Times case, that tries to have this balancing test, right? Because we want to have robust public discourse. We want there to be, robust investigative journalism. So there are different standards for defamation when you talk about a public official versus an everyday person. And the idea, again, is that we need to be able to have critique of our public officials in public forums. And so there is still that line where defamation occurs if somebody goes just beyond the pale. I saw Commissioner Curtis Richardson on here earlier. Thanks for joining us, Commissioner Richardson, a public official. And the law sort of recognizes, if you're a public official, you have particularly put yourself out there and subjected yourself to public scrutiny. So it's a higher burden to get for that public official to claim defamation. But if somebody's acting with actual malice, if John Harris Maurer were a commissioner and somebody's out there saying John Harris Maurer, abuses puppies with no basis, that is clearly a false statement that is just intended to harm my reputation. I would have a recourse at that stage, but it's a pretty high bar. If somebody were to just say, John Harris isn't as responsible with public funds as he could be, that's probably not defamation. It's sort of more wishy-washy, hard to prove. But for members of the general public get a lower standard, which is to say it's actually easier for them to bring a defamation claim because they have not put themselves out sort of for public consumption in that way. This bill makes it easier to bring defamation claims. That is to say, it makes it easier for those public officials to turn around and sue the media. And it is absolutely progeny of this sort of complaint we've heard for years now from originally the Trump administration and now the DeSantis administration about how they're treated unfairly by the media, right? The mainstream media is out on a witch hunt. They're, lying about whatever. If it is easier for those public officials to bring a defamation claim, it's, again, a censorship and chilling effect on those reporters who are more worried about, how many sources do I need to have verified for something before I can publish a story? Or do you just walk away at some point and say, it's too burdensome to do that? An area that is particularly relevant for Equality Florida was interesting. In the House bill, it had a provision saying that, claims that somebody is sexist, racist, homophobic, or transphobic are per se defamation. Just say basically that automatically hits the threshold of being so offensive and malicious that the reporter or an individual could be held liable for leveling that claim. And of course, the defense to defamation is if something is true. You can say something that is really offensive and really damning about somebody if it is true. In the sense of homophobia and transphobia, the law also went on to say that you cannot point to somebody's religious or quote unquote scientific beliefs to prove that this is true. So again, really elevating that standard and making it not just more difficult to allege that somebody is sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, but putting more of these like criminal repercussions on calling out that behavior. And we all know there are clearly actions out there that are expressly racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic. And we need to be able to have those conversations and to talk honestly about that when it's happening and call it out. But in this sort of censorship regime, this is one of those ways that they're trying to tamp down on that discussion.
It just sounds like they want permission they just want the permission to say all these hateful things, and they won't have any accountability, is what you're saying.
Correct.
The broader impact is higher suicide rates and sadly more drug addiction. Are they addressing those issues that are the real issues?
They
with
sadly
these
are
awful
not.
bills?
I'll say two things there. First, just overall, what's on the agenda is not responsive to the needs and concerns of everyday Floridians. If they were really responding to that, they would be addressing affordable housing, they would be addressing insurance reform. I mean, there are so many real problems and issues that Floridians are struggling with. But those aren't sort of the red meat political issues that Governor DeSantis wants for a Republican presidential primary. So instead, they're worried about drag shows. So first, clearly not responding to the issues. Second, there are very real consequences from these sort of attacks, things like suicide, mental health implications. No, they are not addressing that. I will say on sort of a John Harris personal soapbox tangent for a second, a lot of the impacts we see for our LGBTQ youth are in the space of mental health. And initially, First Lady Casey DeSantis was making a really big push around mental health and mental health awareness. And we've seen a shift from focusing on mental health to focusing on resiliency which sort of feels like just an interesting language change. Like, sure, resiliency, like, let's all, I don't know, pull ourselves up by our emotional bootstraps. But what it really does is it gives a pass to looking at what the causes are that are driving that sort of mental health crisis. You know, we should be focused on addressing those problems and what is aggravating mental health, not just trying to tell people to suck it up on the back end. So, personal soapbox, really frustrated about that reframing towards resiliency. But in terms of mental health altogether, I think one of the most damning things we're seeing the state do is just move away from the data on that. So again, we can't even have the conversation. There is a tool called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, YRBS, that has been going on for decades in coordination between the Department of Health and Department of Education. And it's a survey of, I think they ask maybe 6th graders and 12th graders, a number of questions that are all anonymous, but it touches on a lot of issues. Substance use, mental health, sexual activity, sort of a slew of issues. And the DeSantis administration has now decided that Florida is withdrawing from that survey, which, mind you, is also done in states across the country. But it was providing really important longitudinal data that we could see things like changes in mental health over the years. And we could see how the mental health statistics for LGBTQ youth compared to their non-LGBTQ peers. Now we are going to get rid of that data and get rid of the survey altogether, because it's harder to say you've got a problem if there's no data to back it up. So that's one of the things that like really just irks me the most, is the willingness to not even support or provide services for those young folks, because it would be politically disadvantageous to show that there are negative consequences from some of these policy moves.
So what you're saying is we have just lived through a pandemic, and there's so many children, students that are acting out because of what we've lived through. People don't react the way we think they should react. And what you're saying is that particular YRBS is now been taken away, so that there's no metric to try to help with mental health for our students?
Correct. And the state has said that they will replace it with something else, but I would wager money on the fact that whatever they replace it with will not be collecting that sort of data on LGBTQ youth in the way that they were before, because they don't want to know those impacts. They know that there are disproportionate impacts for certain communities, and if you don't want to serve those communities, you just don't ask the question.
Oh boy. What can we are 4,000 strong. We are women of Democratic Women's Club. We are all around the state. What can we do in our local neighborhoods to provide some type of support in your?
Yeah, a great question. I mentioned earlier reaching out to lawmakers, including the allied ones, and just letting them know that you're still there, you're still watching, you appreciate what they're doing. I really think they do need that support right now. And it's a question that Equality Florida is thinking about as well, because we have traditionally had a pretty sizable moderate coalition. When we had our big non-discrimination legislation, we had 19 Republicans who signed on to that bill, not just folks who would sort of tell us quietly behind closed doors that they would support it, but folks who publicly wanted to put their name on there. There would not be 19 Republican names on that bill now. So our strategy is moving a little bit too, from those sort of trying to have conversations and building bridges with some of those folks. There are still some that we can work with. There are a lot who just sort of refuse to acknowledge just our basic humanity. So it's really hard to have that conversation there. But one of the pivots that I think we're making is more about expanding the network and expanding that public education. So that can look like finding 5 or 10 folks to talk to mention that, you went to this meeting, you're involved with your local Democratic Women's Club. Did you know this is happening? Is that, your kid's teacher? Is that somebody you go to, whatever sort of store you go to, or your hairstylist or barber or whatever it is, and having more of those conversations, it's really easy to tune out. And I'm sure you all know, like, if you're here tonight, you're paying attention, you're probably frustrated by it. I understand why a lot of people are like, I just, my 9 to 5 is hard enough. I don't need one more thing to worry about. But we've got to get folks to understand what's at stake and what's happening. Otherwise, I think we do see this sort of slow shift towards authoritarianism, and folks don't really recognize it until you're sort of that pot, the frog in that slowly boiling pot of water. We've got to get folks to realize, what's going on. And I think that peer-to-peer connection is really powerful, because somebody can see, a video from John Harris in their Facebook newsfeed, but like, they're not going to listen to me in the way that that your peers will listen to you and value your perspective and opinion. And they know that you do things like your women's club and you're paying attention and you're a trusted source of information there. So that peer-to-peer outreach is really.
I'm sorry. Just know that we are 4,000 strong. I am the chair of the Tally Days, and we have different regions, different clubs that will be visiting the Capitol starting next week, starting on the 6th, starting at the beginning of session. And we will be sitting in on some of those subcommittee and committee meetings, and we will support, or we will say no to some of these awful bills. I thank you so much, John Harris, for coming, and Madam President, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I too, John Harris, want to thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. It is absolutely just terrifying and disgusting, the hate that's coming out of Tallahassee from these Republicans. And I can promise you that the folks here that are joining us in this meeting, we have a legislative team that meets tomorrow evening. We will share with our clubs, we will promise you that the work that we do through grassroots efforts, through phone calls and emails and letters to the editor and all of these things, we will make sure that we are standing together on these just difficult bills. We know that it's going to be a very difficult year, and we know it's going to be really hard to stop these things. But it won't stop us from being in these sessions and standing up and speaking to the legislators, or sitting in a room and talking with them and just voicing our opinion, because unless we say this is wrong, unless we say this is hate, even though we're told that, to call, someone hateful or bigoted or prejudiced or any of those things is wrong, it's not wrong. And people are what they are, and we have to be able to call it as we see it. Just like we couldn't say Trump was a liar when he was absolutely a liar. We can't let those things stand. So we will stand with you and make sure that the folks in Florida know that this is not who Floridians are. So I want to thank you, John Harris, for joining us and sharing with us. I'd further ask the members on this call, if you are not a member of the legislative advocacy team in your club, and you want to consider joining your legislative advocacy team, or joining the meetings on Tuesday night, Francine, can you drop Jean's email address in the chat? We want to make sure that members are participating in those very, very informative, important meetings on Tuesday nights. And we want to thank you for joining us this evening. We won't have a meeting next Monday, but we will be following up the second Monday in March, and we will let you know what and who, depending on what the heck is coming out of Tallahassee. So thank you, John Harris. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Good night, everybody.
Good invitation.
Really appreciate you, John.
And I thank you so much, John Harris, for joining us. Boy, has it
Thank
been
you.
enlightening. What he's saying is cruelty is the point.
It is, unfortunately.
Our students do not deserve this. They deserve better.
Nope.
So much better. So